We have spent all offseason working to this point right here. Hours of research, drafting. Now it's time to actually set our lineup. So what are we going to do in week one? Clearly, we're starting our studs. But how risky are some of our starting running backs? Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to week one content. NFL season is officially here. I couldn't be more excited to be sharing with you our brand new revamped start and sit episodes for the 2024 season. We are going to be talking about every running back from every single matchup. So regardless of how deep of a league you play in or what type of a league you play in, this is all the information that you need to make roster decisions in week one. Now, before we talk about Thursday night football, let me give you a really quick explanation on what these videos are meant to do. For every single matchup, we're going to be looking at three key defensive categories for every team. We want to know how many fantasy points did that position score against the opposing defense last season, how many yards were put up, and how many touchdowns were scored. And then we're going to give each player a designation, whether it be low risk, medium risk, or high risk. So this week you can make a determination on how much risk you actually want in your lineup. Low risk guys, obviously we love them this week, but even some of the biggest studs in the NFL could have a high risk designation. It doesn't mean that we're going to sit them this week, but it does mean based on your matchup, maybe you need to be very careful with how you set your lineup. And we'll have a key on screen for every single graphic, so you'll be able to follow along easily from start to finish, Thursday night football to Monday night football. And for week one, because obviously there's no regular season statistics yet, we're going to use numbers from 2023 and then decide whether or not those numbers could be accurate in 2024, or if the opposing team has changed and that outcome could be way different now. And how about this? Last season's week one running back start and sit video got 5,242 likes on it. If we can beat that like number, I'm going to give away an autographed Christian McCaffrey mini helmet. And I'll talk about that more here in a few minutes. I think it's about time that we stop wasting time. Thursday night football, the defending champion Kansas City Chiefs welcome in the Baltimore Ravens. Same face, new place, Derrick Henry, who we have loved all offseason long. And now on Thursday night football in this new offense, he's got a chance to shine. But the Kansas City Chiefs defense was fairly good last season at limiting points to opposing running backs, allowing the 5th fewest rushing touchdowns and the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Derrick Henry still ran for over 1,100 yards and 12 rushing touchdowns in that abysmal Tennessee offense last year. Now he's going to be in a better offense with better offensive weapons and a better offensive line. Do we really not think that he can't at least match those numbers? Gus Edwards had 13 rushing touchdowns for this Ravens team last season. Give me some Derrick Henry to find the end zone and be a super solid play for you in week one of the season. He's got a chip on his shoulder. And the best part about this offense, Lamar Jackson isn't like Jalen Hurts. He's not stealing a bunch of goal line carries. Derrick Henry is going to be the guy in Baltimore. Last season, the Baltimore Ravens defense only allowed 5 rushing touchdowns, the fewest in all of football. But they were middle of the pack when it came to rushing yards allowed, and that's where Isaiah Pacheco can make his mark this week. This new offense for the Kansas City Chiefs with more speed on the outside is going to make things way better for Isaiah Pacheco to be way more consistent with more bigger runs up the middle. Now, he could have some trouble finding consistent runs. He might find himself running for a couple of yards at a time. But Baltimore is going to have to turn their attention to Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, Rashee Rice. And when that happens and he finds a hole, Pacheco could end up breaking off a couple of long runs this week. And let's hope all the talk about his inclusion in the passing game also comes to fruition and he picks up some extra points that way. Pacheco's going to bring a little bit of risk this week, but hopefully those big plays and a few yards in the passing game will help balance things out. In addition to Thursday night football in week 1, we get Friday night football as the NFL for the first time kicks off in Brazil. Not only is Green Bay and Philadelphia a tough enough matchup, but now they're going to have to do it overseas on a Friday night. This could end up being a really good game. Or will we get one of those London-esque games where things just don't seem to pan out? Really, the only part of Philadelphia's defense that seemed to work consistently last season was their run defense. They actually did a really solid job of stopping the run. And here in week 1 going up against Green Bay, we know Josh Jacobs is going to get all of the volume. A.J. Dillon, done for the season. Marshawn Lloyd, not healthy to begin the year. It's going to be the Josh Jacobs show, but how high is his ceiling this week? That's the biggest question. Really, it all depends on what the Philadelphia offense does, because if they're humming, moving the football, and scoring, Green Bay could find themselves in a position to have to throw to try and keep up. If that happens, Josh Jacobs goes from having a really nice floor and decent ceiling to having a much lower ceiling. He'll get plenty of touches. He's the main guy and really the only healthy guy that they should be using at the running back position right now. But any type of a deficit definitely could take the ball out of his hands. Saquon Barkley definitely could have himself a super nice floor this week with an extravagant ceiling to go with it. Last season, the Green Bay defense ranked just outside the top 10 of most fantasy points and most rushing yards allowed to running backs. But they were tied for the 5th most rushing touchdowns allowed to running backs. Saquon Barkley has heard the noise all offseason long about how he's a traitor, about how he went to the in-division rivals. All of that garbage is in the rearview mirror now, and he is absolutely going to look to make a statement in week 1 going up against Green Bay. I really like Philadelphia in this matchup, and I believe that if they stay balanced and play with a lead, Saquon Barkley is going to see plenty of touches on the ground. The biggest thing that I'm interested in seeing this week is how is he going to be utilized in the passing game. Pittsburgh's going to be kicking off in Atlanta for week 1 this season. Can you say Arthur Smith revenge game? Okay, maybe not. But I am ready to jump all on board for Najee Harris in week 1 going up against Atlanta. Arthur Smith is going to want to dial up the run, and he's going to want to outmuscle his former team that fired him. Over on Underdog, I'm going to take the higher of 51.5 rushing yards for Najee Harris in week 1 going up against Atlanta. And quite honestly, even if that line changes a little bit before this video comes out, I would be willing to go all the way up to like 55 yards. Jalen Warren has been banged up. Najee Harris is the main back, and we know that Arthur Smith is going to want to run the football. Now, Atlanta's defense was tough last season against running backs, but that doesn't mean that running 3 tight ends out there and just playing power football won't be enough for Najee Harris to get 20 plus carries and pick up 50 or more yards. In fact, that's going to make Najee Harris my Manscaped must start of the week. I am absolutely buying into Najee Harris having a really safe floor, and if he finds the end zone this week, a decent ceiling to go with it. And listen, when your significant other gives you the call and tells you it's time to start, we need to make sure that we're always prepared, and Manscaped is here to help you with that with their awesome line of tools. And if you need Manscaped to help you prepare for the regular season, head on over to Manscaped right now and use code word Headliners20 to get you 20% off any of their great products and free shipping on top of that. And if you think that Arthur Smith wants to dial up the run and outmuscle Atlanta, you best believe Bijan Robinson is going to want to do the same thing. He is going to want to absolutely embarrass his former head coach this week. And I could see Bijan Robinson having an absolute stellar day, especially considering the fact that Kirk Cousins in his first game action position, since tearing his Achilles last season, is going to have to face TJ Watt in this tough Steelers pass rush. Last season, the Steelers' run defense was prone to giving up some big games. They allowed the 11th most fantasy points and the 10th most rushing yards to running backs last year. And Bijan Robinson hopefully is much more of a featured back this year. Tyler Algier could end up seeing a few touches, but for me personally, I don't think it's enough to really downplay what Bijan Robinson is going to mean to this offense in 2024. Arizona and Buffalo is going to bring a new look for both of these offenses. Arizona adding Marvin Harrison Jr., and then on the other side of the ball, Josh Allen losing some of his top targets from last season and now going with Keon Coleman on the outside instead. But we're focused on the run game in this episode, and James Conner going up against Buffalo could have a fairly inconsistent day. I think the volume is going to be there. Arizona knows to win this game on the road at Buffalo, they're going to have to stay balanced, keep the ball away from Josh Allen, which means run the football successfully with James Conner. And I do think that they may be able to do that to start the game, but it's later in the game that I would become worried that James Conner starts to lose his ceiling because Arizona is down by multiple scores and has to start throwing the football. Also, how often does Kyler Murray end up running it? James Conner brings some substantial risk this week. The floor may not be that awful, but later in the game, his ceiling could disappear. For as different as the Arizona Cardinals offense may end up looking, their defense may not look different at all, and that is not a good thing. It's no secret they had one of, if not the worst defense in all of football last season, and now it's going to get tested in week 1 on the road against Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills. Now, this could be a great kickoff to the season for James Cook. James Cook really needs to get off to a fast start this year. And the Arizona Cardinals tried to address issues on the defensive side of the ball. They spent their 3 first picks on defensive players, but those are all guys that are going to have to develop. For me personally, taking a look at things this week, James Cook should end up being a super safe play going up against a defense that allowed some of the most yards, most fantasy points, and most touchdowns to running backs. Tennessee at Chicago brings together two teams that spent quite a bit of money in the running back free agent market this offseason. For the Tennessee Titans going up against the Chicago Bears, though, I'm not in love with Tony Pollard or Tajay Spears this week. Here's a crazy stat from last season. The Chicago Bears allowed the 10th most fantasy points to the running back position, but they allowed the 4th fewest touchdowns and the 5th fewest rushing yards. It's because they allowed a league-high 1,003 receiving yards to running backs last season, over 200 more yards than the team right behind them. But here's the problem in this matchup. While Tony Pollard would be a really good running back to take advantage of that, Will Levis isn't exactly a check down quarterback. He's got the big arm and he pushes the ball down the field. So for me, there's a whole lot of risk with trying to go with Pollard or Spears this week, knowing that running into that Chicago defense probably isn't going to do them a whole lot of good. And even if they continue to pound the football, it doesn't mean that they're going to break enough big plays to make their day. And if they don't get those checkdowns and they don't get that work in the passing game consistently, it's going to be hard to start either of them. And we don't even know the rotation that's going to happen at this point. Yeah, they spent a lot of money on Tony Pollard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Tajay Spears isn't going to get any looks. I think Pollard will still end up being the guy. I think he could see upwards of 60% of the snaps. But this week against Chicago, trying to figure that out against a tough defense may not be the best start you can make. With Jeffrey Simmons in the middle of your defensive line, stopping the run becomes a little bit easier. The biggest question on Chicago's team right now is going to be their offensive line, and trying to find any consistency this week going up against Tennessee could be really tough for DeAndre Swift. For him to have a decent floor this week, he's going to need to be utilized in the passing game, and he's going to have to see 5 or more targets. I don't think he's going to be able to find on those with Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen, and DJ Moore potentially having themselves a day. Right now for DeAndre Swift, this isn't the best week to put him in your lineup. If you drafted him as your RB3 flex option and you need to, go ahead. But the ceiling may not be all that great this week, and you may be begging for a touchdown all day long. New England will head to Cincinnati in week 1, and Cincinnati last season was okay, borderline bad at stopping the run. And unfortunately, they lost DJ Reader in free agency. Now, they have tried to fill that hole with Sheldon Rankings, but how much better will this defense actually be against the run this season? Ramondre Stevenson has a really good chance to get things started off hot in week 1. But my concern isn't Ramondre Stevenson, it's the offensive line, because during the preseason, they looked awful. 2 seasons ago, Ramondre Stevenson posted some of the most efficient and dynamic numbers of any running back in the NFL. The breakout truly was on. Now, last season, things didn't work out all that well. Again, really poor quarterback play and poor offensive line play. Maybe Jacoby Brissett will be just enough to keep things balanced for this New England offense this season. And hopefully Ramondre Stevenson can find some big holes for some big plays this week, even if consistency isn't the main key to him having a big fantasy day. Also, we're going to be on the lookout for how often Ramondre Stevenson is utilized in the passing game compared to Antonio Gibson. I don't see Antonio Gibson getting a whole lot of touches on the ground, but if he's stealing a ton of passing work from Ramondre Stevenson, that could definitely become an issue for his ceiling the rest of the season. Last season, the New England defense allowed the 4th fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs. Even after trading Matthew Judon, that's not great news for Zach Moss. Last season, the New England defense allowed the 10th most receiving yards to opposing running backs. That's great news for Chase Brown. Chase Brown seems all but locked into a role that's going to allow him to see the most opportunity through the passing game. But also, he could start to steal touches away from Zach Moss on the ground. He's the more dynamic runner at this point. And he's also been utilized on 3rd downs in the passing game to help pass protect a little bit more often in the preseason and in training camp. He's much improved from that last season. Chase Brown could really end up becoming the guy in Cincinnati. It may not happen in week 1, and in week 1 we're probably hoping for more passing work than anything, but time will only tell. And fortunately enough for Chase Brown owners, I think that time could come pretty early in the season. Houston at Indianapolis is going to be a great divisional matchup to kick off the first week of the season, and this one is going to be a ton of fun to watch. And Joe Mixon could end up being in for a huge first game with his new team, going up against this Indianapolis rush defense. Last season, Indianapolis allowed the 6th most rushing yards, the 4th most touchdowns, and the 5th most fantasy points to the running back position. And imagine needing to keep track of Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, Stephon Diggs, and Nico Collins while also keeping enough guys in the box to help with the run. Even though Joe Mixon has missed a large chunk of training camp, and he may see a fewer amount of carries this week just to make sure he's eased back in, the efficiency could be huge. And over on Underdog, I am absolutely taking the over of 53.5 rushing yards this week. And if you want to play along with any of the pick'ems that I talk about throughout the week over on Underdog, make sure you get signed up right now using code word headliners. All you need to do is deposit at least $10. Underdog is going to hit you with up to $1,000 deposit bonus. And on top of that, if you haven't drafted as of yet, you can still get our draft guide for absolutely free. And to kick off the first week of the regular season, Underdog is running promotions all week long. There could not be a better time to get signed up and play along with us. Things may not be as easy on the other side of the ball for Jonathan Taylor. Last season, Houston allowed the 6th fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs, and their defense is probably going to be one of the better defenses in all of football once again. Jonathan Taylor could have some inconsistencies the first week. Now, to be fair, last season in week 18, Jonathan Taylor ran for 188 yards on 30 carries. We know that he can go up and play well against this Houston defense. But week 1, I think things could be a lot different this year. Indianapolis has to establish the run. They've got to utilize him and Anthony Richardson to get the ball rolling and open up lanes for the passing game. So he's going to see plenty of carries. But if some of that efficiency becomes a concern and he's not snapping off some of those bigger carries like we saw last season, then at that point, his ceiling becomes lower and lower. I'm not sitting Jonathan Taylor this week, but I do know there is a little bit more risk associated with him than what we would normally see. I'm sure a lot of eyes are going to be on the Jacksonville and Miami matchup with 2 running backs that were drafted heavily in the 2nd round. Travis Etienne could end up having a tough week though. Christian Wilkins is gone from the Miami front line, and that loss is going to be felt. But a lot of this is going to be game script dependent for Travis Etienne. We already know that Doug Peterson has made the comments that he wants to cut his workload down a little bit this season. Well, where is that workload going to be cut out from? Is it going to be in the passing game? Is it going to be on the ground? If Miami gets up on Jacksonville and is leading the majority of the game by multiple scores, Jacksonville's not going to be able to run the football. They're not going to be able to stay balanced. So for Travis Etienne to have himself a big fantasy viable day, he's going to have to make an impact in the passing game. Hopefully, we're not taking away any targets from him, and he can make that impact and still be stable for your fantasy team. Jacksonville was middle of the road last season when it came to stopping the run. They did a pretty good job of limiting those volume stats, rushing yards and touchdowns. They were inside the top 10 of fewest allowed in both of those categories. But they allowed the 3rd most receiving yards to running backs last season. And we know Devon Achane is going to be utilized more in the passing game this season. So while him and Mostert on the ground may not have the giddy up that we would like in week 1, Achane is going to make up for that, hopefully with his work in the passing game, knowing that this Jacksonville defense struggled a lot with that last season. So while the upside will be there for both Achane and Mostert, I'm going to go ahead and give a low risk rating to Devon Achane in week 1, simply because his work in the passing game could be the difference. Carolina did a lot of work on their offense this offseason, but week 1, in New Orleans, that's definitely not the best way to get off on the right foot. Even though New Orleans gave up a fair amount of yards on the ground to running backs last season, they limited scoring. Inside the top 10 of fewest amount of touchdowns and fantasy points allowed to the running back position. More than likely, Carolina will be playing from behind for a majority of this game, and that's not great for Chuba Hubbard, who is expected to be the starter right now while Jonathan Brooks continues to heal up. But what type of a role will Miles Sanders end up having as well? There's a lot of question marks about this backfield with Carolina. I do believe Chuba Hubbard will be the guy over Miles Sanders, for right now anyway. But in week 1 on the road at New Orleans, I'm definitely not trying to find a spot in my lineup for him. But we are absolutely going to highlight Alvin Kamara, whose current rushing line over on Underdog is set at 53.5 yards. If we're not hammering the over on that, then I don't know if we're even doing fantasy football correctly. Carolina's defense allowed the 4th most rushing yards, the 4th most fantasy points, and the most rushing touchdowns last season to running backs. And unfortunately, Brian Burns is gone now, and I don't really see where Carolina's defense got a whole lot better in that aspect of their game. I definitely wasn't feeling Kamara this offseason, but in week 1, absolutely. If you drafted him, lock him in for a really good week. Really, there's only one player that isn't a question mark on the Minnesota offense to begin the season, and that's Justin Jefferson as they head to New York to face the Giants in week 1. And for new running back quarterback Aaron Jones coming over from the division rival Green Bay Packers, he still carries some question marks about him. He doesn't have the best injury history, and Ty Chandler is a guy that's definitely fighting to take snaps away from him. Now, the Giants' run defense last season was a major problem, but they've done a lot to try and fix that, including adding guys in the middle of their defense and trading for Brian Burns from Carolina to play edge. So even though the matchup looks good on paper based on 2023 numbers, this run defense for New York, I believe, will be much better in 2024. And this is going to be a really tough matchup for Aaron Jones, who will need to find the end zone to really make his fantasy day viable for your lineup. Devin Singletary for me this week is actually going to be a low risk start. And it's not because I think he has a high ceiling, it's because I think his floor is really good this week. I don't think he's going to give you any type of a top 12 performance. In fact, I think he's going to be borderline RB3 or RB2. But he's a low risk for me because this is a good matchup for him, and I could see him getting 20 plus touches as the Giants try to stay balanced to begin the year. Minnesota in the middle of their defense isn't all that strong, and Devin Singletary definitely could have a decent game. Even if he only runs for 75 to 80 yards, if he could score a touchdown, he's definitely going to give you at least flex numbers this week, even without that touchdown. But his ceiling, realistically, is probably only top 24. I'm not sure there's a matchup this weekend that doesn't bring more question marks at the running back position than Las Vegas and the Los Angeles Chargers. And for a lot of you out there, you are desperate for Zamir White to be a thing. And I get it. I understand that because of how he finished last season. But I do think that people are maybe overthinking that process a little bit. I'm still not on Zamir White. And this preseason continued to show that Las Vegas still has question marks about him. He was out there playing snaps when there was no other starters left. He was coming on and off the field and wasn't always working with the starters. He was getting goal line carries in the third quarter when everyone had been taken off the field. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense. And to me, that type of usage shows that Las Vegas doesn't fully trust him or know what roles their running backs are going to fill. Now, this matchup against the Chargers, it's not the worst and it's absolutely not the greatest. But the key to him being fantasy viable this week will absolutely be scoring a touchdown, especially if we continue to see a rotation at the running back position. And for the LA Chargers, we know Jim Harbaugh is going to run the football, but is it going to be Gus Edwards? Is it going to be J.K. Dobbins? Who's going to end up leading the backfield? Is someone going to get some work in the passing game? Does Kamani Vidal get some carries this week? There are a whole lot of question marks that are going to need to be answered by the Chargers. Using one of these running backs for your fantasy team may take a couple of weeks to figure out, but week one should give us a really good indication on where they're heading. One of the most questioned backfields in all of football this season was absolutely the Denver Broncos. Samaje Perine, he is gone. Javonte Williams appears to be the starter, but what will Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime do to take some touches away from him? Last season, Seattle allowed the second most fantasy points and second most touchdowns to running backs while allowing the fifth most rushing yards. But adding Byron Murphy in the first round to the middle of that defense absolutely will help with some of those numbers. Now, one player doesn't change an entire defense, but Mike McDonald absolutely will have a much better defensive plan this season for the Seattle Seahawks. Javonte Williams should end up leading the way. And quite honestly, if he was the lead back and we knew that we would get 20 touches out of him this week, he would be a low-risk candidate for me. But we really don't know how this backfield is going to be split. And that's going to be the biggest question mark. They're going to run the football. There's no way Bo Nix is throwing the ball 30 or 35 times this week. They are going to run the football. Hopefully it's Javonte Williams, and hopefully he gives you a really solid floor. Denver had one of the worst defenses overall in football last season, but a lot of that came from getting absolutely smacked by Miami early in the year. Later in the season, their defense started to come around. But they've made a few additions to the defense, but nothing crazy. Patrick Surtain is the main guy there, and we know he's going to be really tough to throw on. So I would not be shocked if Seattle leans on the run game. And with a healthy Kenneth Walker going up against that front, I could definitely see a big day in store for him. Dallas at Cleveland has all the makings of a defensive slugfest. These are two of the top defenses coming back from last season, and honestly, they both bring back a lot of the same unit. And right now, Dallas's run game isn't scaring anyone. Zeke Elliott looks slow in the preseason. Rico Dowdle, he has shown some spurts last year, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to be the guy that takes things over the top. Unfortunately, on the road at Cleveland, Dallas could become really one-dimensional. And if that happens, I wouldn't anticipate Rico Dowdle or Zeke Elliott making any type of a significant impact, especially against this Cleveland defense. The day isn't going to be any easier for Jerome Ford. Now, last season, Jerome Ford, when he took over for Nick Chubb, he was pretty good. He was okay. I think sometimes he was a little bit overvalued, and I think people thought his ceiling was a lot higher than what it actually was. This week against Dallas, his ceiling isn't going to be all that great, and he's going to need some work in the passing game to make up for it. Scoring a receiving touchdown absolutely would be the key to unlocking some top 24 potential this week. But for me, Jerome Ford against a really tough defense is more of a flex option. I think Washington is going to need to answer a lot of questions against Tampa Bay for us before we really decide on who we're going to rely on in our lineup from Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler. Vita Vea up the middle for Tampa Bay absolutely makes this one of the more tough defenses to run against. You have to consistently bounce the ball to the outside and keep it away from him. But is Brian Robinson going to get all those touches on the ground? Is Austin Eckler going to be regulated to a pass catching role? We really don't know either of those two things. Now this week, I do believe Tampa Bay is going to be the better team going up against Washington. So Austin Eckler could end up being on the field more often, especially if Washington ends up being down by multiple scores in this game. We're going to want to keep an eye on that, but I don't know if I want to consider Austin Eckler in anything other than PPR flex options. Rachaad White absolutely has an opportunity to pick up where he left off last season. Going up against a Washington defense that was terrible last year and really didn't do anything to address the run portion of their defense, Rachaad White could see that efficiency question mark taken out of the equation this week. Will his volume be as high? Possibly not. Bucky Irving is looked at as being a guy that will start to take some snaps and touches away from him. So when we start to lose volume, we have to increase efficiency. Luckily enough for Rachaad White, this would exactly be the week to do that. Sunday Night Football is going to have a rematch of last year's NFC wildcard, the LA Rams coming back to Detroit. Matthew Stafford back at Ford Field. Will he be welcomed any differently? That doesn't really matter here. We're talking about the running backs, and Kyren Williams definitely struggled last season on the ground in that playoff matchup. For as bad as Detroit's secondary was at times last season, they allowed the fewest rushing yards and fewest fantasy points to the running back position last year, and they got even better in the middle of their line with DJ Reader. Kyren Williams, for me, going up against Detroit this week, absolutely is going to have some risk. And I do believe that LA is going to have to focus on throwing the ball and attacking that young secondary that's been rebuilt by the Detroit Lions in order to win this game. Last season in the wildcard round, Williams ran for an okay 61 yards on 13 carries. I would expect a line pretty similar to that. Maybe he does end up scoring this time, but I don't know if the volume will get much better. Last season, the LA Rams allowed the second fewest fantasy points to the running back position, and I don't care. We are firing up Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery this week. Last year in their wild card matchup, both of these guys found the end zone. And I don't think people are talking enough about the impact of Aaron Donald missing in the middle of that defense will have on the people around him. They've done a decent job to try and infuse some youth back into that defense to make up for the spot that Aaron Donald is going to be missing from. But I don't think it's enough this week with Jahmyr Gibbs on the ground and through the air with some big explosive plays, and David Montgomery later in the game just running at that worn down LA defense and absolutely closing out the game for a big Detroit win in week 1. There will be a ton of storylines for Monday Night Football, the New York Jets heading out to the San Francisco 49ers. And I absolutely love Breece Hall this season. I have told a lot of people that he is a really close second to Christian McCaffrey for me in the running back rankings. But week 1 is not going to be easy, and he is definitely going to need to make an impact in the passing game this week in order to reach the fantasy upside that we really need to have from him. I definitely would expect some inconsistencies from him this week. He may rattle off a few carries where he's only picking up 2 to 3 yards, but really for Breece Hall, it takes one play, whether it be on the ground, whether it be through the air. And with Aaron Rodgers coming back from that Achilles injury and not really knowing how healthy he truly is right now, there's no way the New York Jets aren't going to run the football. So again, volume could be great. Definitely could have a decent floor just because of that. But if San Francisco can contain him and not give up that big play, he's not going to have the ceiling that we would want and need from our top running back. Attacking the New York Jets defense on the ground was the way to go last season. They are big in the middle and they're athletic and they can shut down the pass as well as anybody in the NFL. But it's Christian McCaffrey. The guy was a RB1 every single week but 2 last season. He only had 2 performances that finished from 12 to 14. He had no performances outside the top 24. I am definitely all on board for Christian McCaffrey having a really good week 1. Throwing the football is going to be very, very difficult for Brock Purdy and this offense, knowing that Brandon Ayuk has essentially missed the entire portion of training camp waiting on that new contract. Christian McCaffrey is going to have to be the guy this week. But just like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I want to give away an autographed Christian McCaffrey mini helmet this week. Last season's week 1 RB start and sit video had 5,242 likes on it. If we can break that and you leave a comment down below telling me what you're most excited for in week 1 of the NFL season, I will pick one of you randomly from the comment section to get the autographed mini helmet. Yo, Headliner Nation, I really hope that you're enjoying these new and improved start and sit videos, a cleaner format that we really took a whole lot of feedback into when creating. We saw your comments, we listened to our Discord, and we took into consideration what you all needed to be successful in fantasy football, and we have implemented it in these videos. Make sure you hit the like button for me, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and make sure that you turn on the bell notifications. Anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. But Headliner Nation, I need to go do wide receivers now. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.